In the history of cinema, I can't think of any franchise celebrated as much as Star Wars. It's a phenomenon. People like to discuss these movies in great detail. People talk about the creatures, the weapons, the vehicles, the planets. It all takes a life of its own that expands well beyond the films. There's comics, novels, video games, all which expand upon the story. Some official, some not official, including fan films and parodies, but all celebrating a beloved franchise. So is there anything I can say about Star Wars that hasn't been said already? I don't know, but I'd like to take a step back and speculate what exactly it is that makes Star Wars so popular. I'm going to focus mostly on the original trilogy. The first big reason I think that it's so popular is because lots of us saw them at a young age. Simple as that. I can never know what it would be like to see them for the first time as an adult. I imagine they'd still be very enjoyable, but seeing them so young makes a permanent impression. I saw them when I was so young I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. I was just amazed at all the monsters and special effects. Then as I grew up, I started paying attention to the plot more, so you gain appreciation for them as you grow up. They get better as time goes on. The first big impressionable highlights to me as a kid was the Mos Eisley Cantina from episode 4. Just imagine a place where all these different aliens could come hang out. Then there's the Imperial Walkers from Empire Strikes Back, giant robots marching in the snow. That image always sticks with me. Then in Return of the Jedi, there's the speeder bikes, and the way they zip through the woods and make that sound, that woo, the way that sound resonates after they make the turn. As a kid, I thought that was so cool, and it still is. All these little details are still cool, but what makes Star Wars so special compared to all the other franchises? Well, one thing is that it never got cheapened with too many sequels. I mean, now we're starting to get there, but still, there's been so many years separating each trilogy, it gives a more elusive factor that a Star Wars movie only comes around when the time is right. Anyone who remembers when there was only 3 movies remembers we had a fully satisfying story arc. Star Wars was the beginning, Empire was the middle, and Jedi was the ending. It didn't feel like 3 separate movies, it felt like 3 chapters belonging to the same story. But that's not to say each movie didn't have its own distinct look and feel. The first one makes you think of the desert, the second one makes you think of the snow, and the third one makes you think of the woods. The special effects were a big part of it. The models, the puppets, the animatronics. It was all pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the art of film. There was a documentary that aired in the 80s called Star Wars to Jedi, The Making of a Saga. It was the first time I saw how special effects like that were done. Also, the sound effects were a big accomplishment. I remember seeing them flicking some wire to make laser sounds, and it was very inspiring how they came up with all these organic ways to do things. Now, I say I grew up with Star Wars like many people did, but there was a time when I fell out of it for a little while. In my early teen years, I disregarded these movies. All I remembered was a bunch of silly puppets. That blue elephant, which I'm sure has a name, the fish-headed Admiral Akbar, the guy with that weird tentacle wrapped around his head, and even Chewbacca always going, "Roar!" Like this was a kid's thing, I thought. It's silly. I grew out of it. And then when I started getting into filmmaking and film history, every time Star Wars would come up, I'd say, what was the big deal? So I gave them another watch. This was around the time of the 20th anniversary when they re-released them on VHS in their classic forms for the last time. I watched them again and immediately I was hooked. It was more than nostalgia. I think that was the first time I was truly invested in the stories and appreciated the movies. But at the same time, since I was studying film, I started to realize that the Star Wars movies were not 100% original ideas. They were inspired by many films and stories that came before. It paid tribute to the past. Star Wars was original in its own way because of how it combined so many of these old ideas together. It's like retelling an old fable in a fresh way. The Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers film serials from the 30s and 40s are the prime example. Right from the opening title crawls, that's exactly where it came from. Even Cloud City was from Flash Gordon, and also the wipe transitions. The whole idea of a film serial was that it happened in episodes. Typically, a film serial would have about 12 chapters. Every week, audiences would return to the theaters and see the next episode, which would show right before whatever the main feature film is. When you watch the first Star Wars movie, meaning the first one that was made, Episode 4, it starts up immediately with the rebels being attacked by the Empire. The opening crawl tells you everything you need to know that happened before, but then it drops you right into the action. That gives the feeling that you're watching part of a larger story. Now, of course, all that came to fruition, all the other movies got made, but Episode 4, the title, was retroactively added into the opening crawl, which is the way it's been since the 1981 re-release. So it has kind of a film serial format. Most modern audiences may never recognize that, but it may subliminally appeal to them for having such a classic storytelling format. Then you have the fact that it looks like everything takes place in a futuristic world. You have spaceships launching into fast speed to go from planet to planet. You have robots and lasers and all this technology, but it takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That gives it more of a fable quality, which I think also appeals to people in a fundamental way. Metropolis was the first major film to paint a view of a science fiction world, and it's no coincidence that C-3PO looks a lot like the robot in it. The walkers are very much like the Martian war machines in the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds. It also may remind you of Wizard of Oz. I can't help but feel C-3PO is the Tin Man and Chewbacca's the Cowardly Lion. The way they meet all these different characters, assembling a motley crew as they go along their journey, it's classic. The Jawas are like the Munchkins. The hologram of the Emperor is like the hologram of the Wizard. Yoda and Obi-Wan disappear when they die. Their clothing collapses into the floor. It's just like the Wicked Witches, how they shrivel up or melt into a puddle. When Luke and Han disguise themselves as stormtroopers, it's like when they disguise themselves as the witches' soldiers. There's, of course, many references to the Kurosawa films, most notably The Hidden Fortress. It's about a princess leading a gang of rebels against an evil empire. It tells the story from the point of view of two humble characters, the same way as R2-D2 and C-3PO. We have samurai, whereas in Star Wars, we have Jedi. We can't help but draw a resemblance between lightsabers and swords and the spiritual connection the characters have with them. The severing of arms is also something you'd see in a samurai film. There's also a lot of references to Western films. The bar scene in Mos Eisley is right out of any given classic Western. The Searchers is the one that gets brought up a lot. The scene where Luke's home gets raided and his family burned, that's the same thing that happens in The Searchers. So it's like a Western film mixed with a samurai film. The main weapons are guns and swords. Even though these weapons have been updated to have a science fiction element to them, the point is usually movies have either swords or guns. You never see people using swords in a gunfight, so most movies pick one world over the other. Star Wars does both, and that makes it awesome. There's also a lot of references to horror films. The casting of Peter Cushing as Governor Tarkin alongside Dave Prowse as Darth Vader, I feel is no coincidence. George Lucas must have been a fan of the Hammer films, such as Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, where Cushing was Dr. Frankenstein and David Prowse was the monster. Then you have Christopher Lee, who played Count Dracula in 7 Hammer films. Even though he retired from playing the character and never wanted to do it again, it's George Lucas we have to thank for getting him to play the next closest thing, Count Dooku. Now I'm jumping to the prequel trilogy, but in Attack of the Clones, Count Dooku is clearly a nod to Dracula. In Revenge of the Sith, when Darth Vader rises from the slab, come on, that's 100% Frankenstein. Even the way Vader walks in that scene is just like the Frankenstein monster. To begin with, Vader's cape has always been reminiscent of Dracula, but his helmet is like a samurai. It's really a crazy hodgepodge if you stop and think about it. The titles are all inspired by B-movies, especially the prequel trilogy like Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. There's this old film serial starring Bela Lugosi called The Phantom Creeps. The name of the first episode is The Menace. Phantom Menace. Well, the characters are all famous archetypes. Luke is the classic hero, Obi-Wan is the classic mentor, much like Frodo and Gandalf, or King Arthur and Merlin. And I've only scratched the surface. There's a wealth of information on Star Wars influences all over the internet, but the fact that Star Wars takes old ideas and makes them into something new shows how ingenious it really was. Some of it you might say George Lucas kinda stole, but all good ideas come from somewhere. It pays tribute to all these old movies, literature, folklore, mythology, and ultimately reflects our culture. It perfectly blends science fiction and fantasy. The science fiction element is obvious, it deals with technology and things that could possibly exist, but the fantasy element comes into play with the Force, for example. It's a less technological thing and more of a magical, spiritual one. But it's also interesting to think about how history repeats itself. Lucas said he based the Emperor off of historical figures, from Julius Caesar to Adolf Hitler. He said you start out in a democracy, and then democracy turns into a dictatorship, and then back again. It's like a cycle. So this also applies to the character arc of Anakin Skywalker, and his son Luke begins to follow the same footsteps, doomed to take the same path. It's a cycle again. It takes classic science fiction, Eastern culture, Western culture, even some biblical references, and retells them all at the same time. It's every epic story ever told rolled into one. Star Wars is popular because it's more than just movies. It's everything. It's the force that binds us.